Hello, everyone, and good evening. I'm Don Arleth, and coming to you live from Warsaw, you're watching World News Tonight. Within 5 years or less, Russia could attack one or more EU countries, said EU Commissioner for Defense and Space, Andrius Kubilius, in Warsaw, as he met with multiple Polish officials, security being on the top of their agenda. We'll get into that in just a bit, but first, the latest headlines. High-level Kremlin official to visit the United States. Devastating tariffs to be announced by Donald Trump. Will the EU be targeted? And Polish presidential stakes are high. Will the government be blocked or allowed to govern? We start off tonight in Warsaw, where a three-day EU informal defense summit is underway. The discussions revolve around the implementation of the White Paper for European Defense Readiness 2030. Will all EU member states be able to live up to the goals set out by the EU Commissioner for Defense and Space? Zuzana Jurek has the details in this report.
A series of meetings is currently underway in Warsaw, with today marking the first set of said meetings. They constitute part of the EU Security Forum, which is based around the White Paper on Defence in Europe 2030. The White Paper, recently published as a result of the work carried out by the EU Commissioner for Defence and Space, Andrius Kubilius, constitutes an outlook for the next 5 years. It identified new approaches to shared defence policy, as well as key shortcomings of the current policy across member states.
In 3 months, Russia makes more weapons than all NATO member states in 1 year. And soon, Putin could be tempted to use that military power. Intelligence services, as you know, report Russia is getting ready to challenge NATO Article 5 even before 2030. In 5 years or less, Russia could be willing and able to attack one or more European Union countries. As Commission President Ursula von der Leyen recently said, to prevent war, we must prepare for the war.
These have been identified as the following and include air and missile defenses, ammunition and missile production most importantly, and military mobility, as well as drone and counter-drone systems. But identifying these capability gaps is just one issue. The question remains on how to address them. In tandem with the White Paper, the European Commission has also introduced the ReArm program, or the ReArm Defence Fund, which makes available 800 billion euros for EU member states to spend on boosting their capabilities. Speaking at a press conference earlier today in the Polish Parliament, the Deputy Prime Minister and the Defence Minister of Poland, Władysław Kosiniak-Kamysz, suggested that Poland could receive 20 billion euros out of this fund as soon as December of this year.
Most of these funds will go toward modernization efforts, which means new purchases. I want to see more production lines for the Piorun air defense system, better manufacturing capabilities for the Borsuk, the contract which has finally been signed. I hope that the Polish Navy in particular will be able to tap these European funds for a significant spending boost.
This afternoon, Kubilius was also hosted by the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Poland, Radosław Sikorski, in Warsaw. During the joint press conference, Kubilius highlighted that Poland is an example to be emulated by other EU members. This conclusion or this suggestion is primarily driven by the defense spending that Poland has already demonstrated being the highest NATO defense spender by a percentage of its GDP, having had reached 4.7% of GDP spending as of this year and expecting to reach 5% by next year. Kubilius has also highlighted the importance of Donald Tusk's, the Prime Minister of Poland, flagship project, the East Shield, at its external border with Belarus. Although these meetings are obviously informal in nature, it is hoped that they will form the basis of the key measures which will therefore be identified and hopefully implemented during the June EU summit. For TVP World, Zuzana Jurek.
Now we go to Ukraine, where attacks on civilians continue on a daily basis, and a ceasefire is still elusive. Let's check in with our correspondent in Kyiv, Oz Chatterjee. Good evening, Oz. So what can you tell us about these latest attacks?
A particularly devastating ballistic missile strike occurred today, hitting Kryvyi in central Ukraine in the Dnipropetrovsk Oblast. 4 people have been killed, 10 others wounded when a ballistic missile struck apartment buildings. Fire has been caused as well in the aftermath. A search and rescue operation is underway. That's according to Alexander Vilkel. He's the head of the city's administration. Now, as you said, talking about the ceasefire, both sides traded accusations targeting energy infrastructure. The Ukrainians insisting they're not doing that. But Zelensky reported another Russian strike hitting an energy substation in Sumy. So the Ukrainians are very unhappy about this. We've reached the 15th day of this 30-day ceasefire that was announced by Putin and Donald Trump after their negotiations, and we're not really seeing any ceasefire on the ground here, as the Ukrainian government has insisted the Russians continue to target energy infrastructure. Now, also hearing, interestingly, from Reuters that the Trump administration, senior officials inside the Trump administration, are now coming to understand the fact that they don't think that a ceasefire is going to be reached in the next few months, and they're starting to think in a longer-term strategy. That certainly looks, again, to be the case here on the ground, where there seems to be no real movement towards any cessation of hostilities. But with these strikes hitting civilians, more people dying in them, it looks like this is going to be the situation for many more weeks to come, particularly if these ceasefire talks don't go anywhere. And at the moment, they don't look like they're going anywhere, Don.
Certainly, absolutely looks like there's still a lot to be accomplished. Oz Chatterjee reporting from Kyiv. Thanks for the report. It's been over 3 weeks since Ukraine agreed in Jeddah, Saudi Arabia, to an unconditional ceasefire, but still there is no prospect of peace. Now, in a first since the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, a top-level Kremlin official will travel to the United States to meet with Donald Trump's special envoy for the peace process. Let's go to Kazimierz Wysiak to explore the prospects for peace in this latest attempt in diplomacy.
This is Kirill Dmitriev, Vladimir Putin's special envoy for international economic and investment cooperation. According to unnamed White House officials and the Kremlin, he may soon travel to the United States in the first visit of a senior Moscow official since Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Dmitriev is rumored to have a meeting scheduled with Steve Witkoff, the US Special Envoy on Ukraine, in the latest round of talks on peace. But experts are skeptical this meeting can bring a breakthrough.
I expect rather there will be continuation of talks with not immediate result, with maybe later blames directed into Ukraine or Europe.
The sole fact that Dmitriev is setting foot on US soil would be unprecedented. In order for him to enter the country, the US government would have to temporarily lift sanctions against him.
I think the Trump administration is very eager, some people would say too eager, to show the Russians that the Trump administration is friendly, is trying to act as a mediator. And this was a gesture, a way of saying, look, we will issue a waiver on sanctions against you.
Please raise your right hand and repeat after me.
It has been more than 2 months since Donald Trump returned to the Oval Office as President of the United States. One of his biggest promises of ending the war in Ukraine quickly still hasn't materialized. And as Russia keeps refusing terms of peace, Trump is starting to show first signs of irritation.
I think that Russia wants to see an end to it, but it could be that they're dragging their feet. I've done it over the years.
While the talks continue, Moscow is not wasting time on the front lines. This week, the Kremlin announced a new wave of conscription. 160,000 men aged 18 to 30 are to be called up for the army. That's just 30,000 less than what Russia amassed at Ukraine's borders in 2022, ahead of the invasion.
It's something which President Putin would like to emphasize that he has got a huge reserve of manpower, and it's a signal towards Ukraine. It's a signal also towards Europe.
These Ukrainian servicemen experienced firsthand Russia's intentions in the war. As Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky paid them a visit, he looked concerned. While his soldiers keep risking their lives for their country, the peace talks are still nowhere near completion. For TVP World, I'm Kazimierz Łysiak.
Europe should brace itself for devastating tariffs to be unveiled tonight by U.S. President Donald Trump. One trade expert told TVP World that if Trump makes good on his promise or his threats to slap 25% tariffs on all EU exports, it could trigger a European recession. Our EU correspondent, Angela Skujins, reports on this bubbling monetary crisis from Brussels.
The US president has previously slapped 25% import duties on all aluminium, steel, as well as car imports into the US, but he has recently threatened slapping 25% levies on all products inbound to the American market. We know that the European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen says that she has been speaking with heads of states regarding appropriate countermeasures, but TVP World asked the EU executive on Monday how they are bracing for this news tonight.
Our response, all I can say is that there will be one. It will happen at the appropriate moment after the expected announcement later this evening. And concerning your question whether we've done maths on the potential impact on the European economy of such measures, the answer is yes, of course.
Now, while the European Commission couldn't speculate on the cost of these tariffs, TVP World spoke to Alsak Berg. Now, he is a research fellow at the European Centre for Reform. He said that if these threats were to become a reality, it would have a huge impact on the European economy and could cost up to 1% of the bloc's GDP. Let's take a listen to what he had to say.
There will be wide-ranging tariffs that will do an enormous amount of damage to European exports and to the European economy. You're talking the EU exports about 500 billion euros worth of goods to the US every year. And the estimates are that, if they impose a 20% tariff, about a third of that might go away.
But is the US the only stable partner for the EU? TVP World asked Alicia Herrera Garcia, an economist and a trade expert from the Bruegel think tank, as to whether Brussels should cozy up to Beijing, as China is a massive economic superpower.
We can't really tilt in the opposite direction, i.e. towards China with China's demands, because they're not feasible in a way. Europe would lose a lot of credibility, and the US is not ready to listen. So in a way, we can't choose. It's not in our hands.
However, all the speculation will be put to bed as that US President Donald Trump outlines his plans tonight to make what he claims will be America wealthy again. We are, of course, expecting that response from the EU over the next couple of days of how they expect to protect the bloc's businesses and consumers. Angela Skujins from Brussels for TVP World.
Politico reports that Donald Trump has told members of his cabinet and others close to him that a billionaire ally, Elon Musk, will soon step back from his government role. The development comes in the backdrop of one of the most expensive judicial races in the United States, despite Musk spending $20 million on the campaign for the conservative Brad Schimmel. His liberal rival Susan Crawford won the election for the Supreme Court of Wisconsin.
In a significant victory for Liberals, U.S. Judge Susan Crawford won a seat on the Wisconsin State Supreme Court on Tuesday, despite a record $20 million in campaign spending from Elon Musk, who backed her conservative opponent, Brad Schimmel.
So I think it's a sign that in Wisconsin, which was a swing state, Donald Trump won it by only 1% last November, that the Republicans are slipping.
A victory for a Democratic candidate in the swing state might align with Donald Trump's growing disapproval ratings.
So it's those voters who are not committed to Trump and who really want to see an improvement in their day-to-day lives that are beginning to turn against him.
The race for the state's highest court garnered national attention, partly due to Musk's substantial involvement, which included offering $1 million checks to selected voters. The Republican candidate also received backing from Donald Trump, who said Schimmel would preserve liberty and justice for all. Susan Crawford's victory, on the other hand, was welcomed by the former president Barack Obama.
Congratulations to Judge Susan Crawford on her victory, and to the people of Wisconsin for electing a judge who believes in the rule of law and protecting our freedoms.
The Wisconsin Supreme Court plays a crucial role in redrawing district maps, which could influence future U.S. House elections. With Susan Crawford's victory, liberal justices will maintain their majority on the state's Supreme Court.
The road to the presidential elections here in Poland is about a month and a half away, and the stakes are high. If an opponent of the ruling coalition wins, that could spell trouble for the policies of Prime Minister Donald Tusk. But if the Tusk-aligned candidate becomes victorious, the ruling coalition just might be able to deliver on the promises it made in the general election of 2023. Our chief political correspondent, Aaron Dahmen, has the details.
The stakes are high in Poland's presidential race for the governing coalition, who have centrist frontrunner Rafał Trzaskowski on their ticket. That's because Prime Minister Donald Tusk has been in a paralysing cohabitation with current President Andrzej Duda ever since he won the general election in 2023. In fact, many of the Civic Coalition's promised reforms have been stonewalled by Duda's edicts.
The president's most powerful prerogative is a negative one. It's the fact that they've got this veto, which, you need a 3/5 majority to overturn, which most governments don't have. The current government doesn't have it.
For more than a year and a half, Tusk has struggled to make inroads, including on overhauling the judiciary stacked by the previous administration. Young people and women, many of whom voted for the coalition, have also been left disappointed around social issues such as abortion and civil partnerships. Trzaskowski is promising that will change.
I am convinced that will finally make this medieval anti-abortion law go away. Dear ladies and gentlemen, women's rights are the most important thing for all of us.
But will a Trzaskowski presidency really unlock Tusk's agenda from one day to the next?
It's going to be very complicated to get things done in the parliament, and they're going to lose the excuse of not voting things through because of Andrzej Duda, the current president. So there is a hope of sort of recalibrating this government.
On the other side of the aisle, the answer is more certain, with both Karol Nawrocki of the Law and Justice Party and Sławomir Mencen of the far-right Confederation set to stall and try cast their own influence on the legislative agenda. The pair have been neck and neck for second place in the polls, but the libertarian Mencen, who's been drawing in young voters with Russian narratives, talked, then tanked last week after an interview on YouTube in which he dismissed abortion even in the case of rape and called for paid university studies.
I am deeply convinced that one cannot kill an innocent child, even if that child is in some ways connected to an unpleasantness. I believe that we would achieve a higher level of education when universities introduce a tuition fee.
Those close to Nawrocki's campaign have revealed to TVP World there are internal discussions over whether he should start specifically targeting young people and women, or focus on consolidating the far right, especially in the second round. Many still expect Trzaskowski and Nawrocki to finish in the top two on May 18 before they head into a final face-off on the 1st of June.
It's a hugely consequential election, probably one of the most important that there's been since 1989. It'll determine what the rest of the government's term, which is set to run till autumn 27, is going to be like. If it loses the election, it'll be completely hamstrung for the rest of its term of office, and the political dynamic that it could set off could even force an early election.
A nervous wait for the government ahead of a new resident in the presidential palace. Aaron Darman, TVP World.
In just a few hours' time, Donald Trump will announce his list of tariffs to be placed on U.S. imports. Meanwhile, it's been over 3 weeks since Ukraine agreed to an unconditional ceasefire, but the war rages on. Are we any closer to reaching an agreement to end the war in Ukraine, or are we further away than ever? Joining us now to discuss these issues is U.S. career diplomat, former U.S. Assistant Secretary of State, and former U.S. Ambassador to Poland, Daniel Fried. Hello, sir, and thank you very much for joining us tonight. We appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Yes. Now, how do you think that these new tariffs will affect the transatlantic and NATO's unity in the months and years to come? Can the Europeans rely on security guarantees of the ally that uses punitive measures against it?
I would try to separate the economic tensions from the overall security relationship. I understand that Europeans react very badly to both the rhetoric of the administration and the economic hits that the administration is going to impose on Europe and on most of the world. But Trump has stated repeatedly his support for NATO, and his meeting with Mark Rutte, NATO Secretary General, a couple of weeks ago was successful. Coming out of that meeting, Secretary General Rutte was pretty positive. He was hopeful about U.S. commitment to NATO. So I would not conflate these issues. On the other hand, Europe will likely retaliate if the U.S. sanctions are what they appear to be, that is directed against Europe as well as other countries. And that may be, best case, hopeful case, start a period of negotiations. Trump loves to seize the initiative, shake things up, and then may try to negotiate from what he considers to be a position of strength. I think that if Europe pushes back, and if U.S. stock markets suffer, that Trump may be more in a mood to negotiate, especially after last night's by-elections in the United States that suggested a softening of support for Republicans. So this is not the end of the world, but it is certainly unpleasant. I have more problems with U.S. threats against Greenland and the nonsense about Canada becoming the 51st state. But the tariffs, however unpleasant, could be resolved through negotiations, and we could get through this. Maybe.
Maybe, a big maybe. Well, we'll see exactly what comes out here in just a couple hours. I'd like to shift the focus now over to Ukraine, because it seems like we're a bit further apart than we were just a couple weeks ago. Now, 3 weeks after Ukraine agreed to a unconditional ceasefire, Putin appears to be stalling on the implementation, as noted by Estonian Prime Minister Kaja Kallas. Former Prime Minister Kaja Kallas, chief diplomat, EU diplomat. Do you believe that strategic objectives of Vladimir Putin in this apparent delaying tactic, if you will, how should Ukraine and its allies respond?
Well, first of all, you are right that Putin is delaying. And not only that, but he has outmaneuvered the Trump administration, at least so far, by saying yes in principle to Trump's ceasefire proposal and then larding it up with conditions that make it impossible to achieve. and he's got the United States basically playing his game. That is a tactical mistake. The better news is that President Trump may be running out of patience with Vladimir Putin's game playing and stalling tactics. And the White House is finally, again, starting to talk about additional pressure on Russia. This is exactly what they should do. The Ukrainians, meanwhile, need to be the party that says yes to the American proposals and not the party that says no. Let Putin be the one who says no. Let Trump come to the correct conclusion that Putin is the problem, and then maybe Trump will take action to put pressure on Putin so that he becomes more reasonable. But you are certainly correct. The Americans are not playing it smart. There are Americans who understand Russia, who have learned the lessons of, let us say, decades of experience with the Kremlin. But it appears the Trump administration is having to learn those lessons from the beginning, all over again. And that's not good. That is a waste of time, and we're allowing Putin to lead Trump by the nose, and hopefully Trump will get tired of this and push back.
Mr. Ambassador, you have a wealth of experience dealing with the Russians. I'd like to ask you about this reported violation of the ceasefire on energy infrastructure by both sides. The Russians accuse the Ukrainians of violating the ceasefire, and then the Ukrainians also say that Russia continues to attack its energy infrastructure. Does the United States need to put something in place to be able to verify who indeed is violating the ceasefire, any agreements that do and are put in place?
It's not clear to me that there is agreement on any ceasefire whatsoever. The Russians are continuing their attacks against Ukraine. Moreover, the Black Sea negotiations produced an unclear set of inconsistent statements in which the Russians made a lot of preconditions for a Black Sea ceasefire, and the Americans did not seem to push the Russians, for example, to stop attacks against the port of Odessa. So this is not a great situation. I think we can count on the Russians not respecting a ceasefire. I think that they will continue not to do so. I think that their need for this ceasefire against energy infrastructure to be respected, Trump is going to have to push it, and I think that the Russians are going to resist. We are nowhere near a serious ceasefire, and we're not going to get near one until the U.S. puts much more pressure on Russia than appears to be the case at the moment.
And finally, Mr. Ambassador, very briefly, because we're almost out of time, Ukraine has reportedly rejected the minerals deal that President Zelensky claims that would effectively restrict Ukrainian sovereignty and the ability to join the European Union. How do you assess the balance between Ukraine's need for economic support versus its insistence on NATO membership and its economic, demands and support right now?
Well, a good minerals deal would be good for everybody. The deal that was supposed to be signed on February 28th, that was the day that the Trump-Zelensky meeting blew up in the Oval Office. That agreement was actually very good. It was a solid piece of work. The draft agreement that the Americans have sent the Ukrainians, it's been published, is much longer, much more complicated, and appears to be unbalanced. That is, it gives the Americans a lot of power. It doesn't give the Ukrainians as much, and it gives the U.S. and U.S. companies right of first refusal for a lot of projects. The Ukrainians should continue to negotiate. The idea of some kind of U.S.-Ukrainian cooperation on development of its natural resources is a pretty good idea. That is, it gives Donald Trump a stake in Ukraine in his terms. So I wouldn't say no to it if I were the Ukrainians, but I would watch out for things they can't accept. Don't be afraid to negotiate a good deal.
Very well said, Mr. Ambassador. Ambassador Daniel Fried, former U.S. Ambassador to Poland, and thank you very much for joining us on World News Tonight.
Thanks for having me.
And that concludes this edition of World News Tonight. Thank you for joining us. Have a wonderful evening, and we'll see you next time. Good night.